All right, welcome to the first lecture for Chapter 8, Overview of Photosynthesis. In this, we're gonna kind of build a foundation to understand photosynthesis. So we'll talk about all the things we need to understand before we get into the process of photosynthesis. Like Chapter 7, again, you want to focus on the overview of the big picture of what's happening. We want to start by talking about autotrophs, and we've probably mentioned these before. But autotrophs make their own food, and most autotrophs are photoautotrophs, which means they're somehow using light as energy. And of course, most of these is light from the sun. But we know with grow lights and certainly in the lab we're going to be using grow lights to stimulate the pond water cultures to get algae to grow there. We know that photons of light energy can come from a variety of sources. This is going to include all the green plants. It's going to include algae. And the cyanobacteria, the photosynthetic blue-green algae. And then there are chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs there aren't very many of them. They're all prokaryotes, bacteria. And what they do is they use inorganic chemicals as an energy source. So remember, an organic chemical has both carbon and hydrogen. So inorganic would have something else. And these would include using carbon dioxide or nitrate or sulfate or iron or something else as an electron acceptor in order to generate energy. Heterotrophs are organisms that have to consume other things, either eating the autotrophs, the primary producers, which would be our primary consumer. But then there can also be secondary and tertiary consumers. For example, you might have a cow that's eating plants, so the cow would be a primary consumer, but then you might be the secondary consumer because you eat the cow, and then you have a mishap on a trail somewhere and run into a big old grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear eats you, and they're the tertiary consumer. So you can have many levels of consumers as you work your way up a food chain. And then there are decomposers. Decomposers are breaking down dead things, both dead producers and all the different types of consumers. And that's really important because, there's only a fixed amount of each element in our world. And if it was used up and tied up in living organisms that were no longer living, it wouldn't be available for new organisms. So recycling nutrients is a real key job of decomposers, by the bacteria and fungi that are going to do that. All in all, though, life on our planet depends on photosynthesis. Most of the energy available to living things comes from the sun. And what photosynthesizers do, photoautotrophs, is they're able to take that potential energy, or actually kinetic energy from photons of light, and convert it to glucose, sugars, stored chemical energy that either the plant can use, either to break it down, and we saw that in Chapter 7, break it down through cellular respiration to generate ATP, or to use the glucose to make all the monomers and polymers that the plant cells are going to need to grow and reproduce and respond to the environment. And of course, anything that eats the plant is going to start bringing all those molecules, not just the glucose, but all the molecules that the plant has made into the food chain. And many of those are going to be modified and reused to build the molecules that the consumers need. And of course, at each step of the process, heat energy is going to be lost. And this is just an ongoing cycle. The raw materials for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. And we're going to produce glucose and oxygen, which are the raw materials for cellular respiration. So these two processes are very much tied to each other. And that waste product of oxygen, and oxygen is a waste product. It's not the intended product. That's the glucose. But it's necessary for aerobic life. When photosynthesis wasn't always around, and we have evidence from this from monoliths, which are fossilized cyanobacteria that were present where there were a lot of shallow seas a long, long time ago. This is looking at billions of years ago. And again, scientifically, they think the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And bacteria have been around, first prokaryotic organisms, somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago. And there are bacteria that, as part of their photosynthesis, they don't release free oxygen. So those bacteria have been around for a long time. But it wasn't until quite a while later that organisms that started to release oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis developed. Now, at that time, nothing used oxygen for cellular respiration. Their respiration was all anaerobic. And so what happened was oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. And as oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, a lot of things happened. First, we developed an ozone layer, which would now filter out a lot of the harmful UV radiation that was hitting the planet from the sun. That really kind of made it impossible for anything to probably live on the land, plants or animals, because there was too much UV. It would cause too many mutations, cause organisms to die. So the UV, or the ozone layer, filtered that out. And of course, the other thing, with oxygen in the atmosphere, it was able to moderate temperature quite a bit better. And so now, instead of the extreme cold at night and extreme hot during the day, there was more ambient temperatures. And with oxygen available, organisms were able to evolve to use it as a terminal electron acceptor. And we saw in the previous chapter that when oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor in cellular respiration, you get the most ATP. And so with more and more ATP being formed, cells were able to get bigger. They were able to develop new structures, to develop new abilities, which allowed for a huge diversity of organisms. And we see that jump. As the oxygen increased, we see a huge jump of organisms that the fossil record shows us started to be present during this time period. So releasing oxygen was really important to developing diversity in life. Now, we've seen this before, redox reactions, but photosynthesis is another redox process, which means that something's going to get reduced while something else gets oxidized. Carbon dioxide and water go in, glucose and oxygen come out. If we look, it's the carbon dioxide. Remember, when you get reduced, you pick up protons and electrons, the equivalent of hydrogen atoms. So the carbon dioxide is gaining all the hydrogen. It's becoming reduced. Meanwhile, the oxygen is losing hydrogen, or the water is losing hydrogens, and it's becoming oxidized. And that's what makes this a redox process. So, discussion question. Again, read it and then pause the video for a second. Think about it. Oxygen is a blank of photosynthesis. Substrate would mean reactant. All right, and the correct answer is a waste product. All right. So where do the reactants for photosynthesis come from for plants? Well, water mostly is absorbed by the roots of plants into the soil. Now, algae are going to get it directly from their environment, as are cyanobacteria. But if we look at plants, roots are going to pull water out of the soil and bring it up. There's a little bit of water that might get into the leaf through the atmosphere, but the vast majority is going to be transmitted up to the leaf from the roots. Carbon dioxide is coming from the air. And in the leaves, which are the organ of photosynthesis in plants, on the underside of the leaf are small holes called stoma. Plural is stomata. And these pores have special cells on either side called guard cells, which kind of look like lips. And here's a stoma with the guard cells on each side, and they're closed right now. And when they're closed, this keeps moisture from leaving the plant, but it also doesn't allow oxygen out or carbon dioxide in. During the heat of the day, most of the time these stoma are going to be closed so that the plant doesn't dehydrate. At nighttime is when many plants open up their stoma, and now carbon dioxide can come in and be stored in the leaf until it's needed for photosynthesis, and any oxygen that was produced can be released when it's not needed by the plant. Now, again, this is, so we're getting carbon dioxide from the air, we're getting water from the roots, we're releasing the oxygen through the stoma, and of course the last thing we need are photons of light energy. Most of that is going to come from the sun, but we know we can use grow lights to stimulate the similar response. Now again, leaves are the main organ of photosynthesis in plants, but not all of the leaf. If we look at a leaf in cross-section, there's an upper and a lower layer called the cortex, and then on top of this is a waxy cuticle. If you've ever looked at leaves or stems or fruit of plants, you'll notice it looks shiny on the surface. And that's because there's a waxy layer there that helps to keep water from being lost by the leaf. Water is really necessary for photosynthesis. And if you lose too much water through just through evaporation or a break in the waxy cuticle, then the plant dehydrates and it wilts, and it's not going to be able to photosynthesize. So it's important not to lose that water. And then once we get down into the middle of the plant, called the mesophyll, the plant leaf, you'll see a lot of empty space. And that empty space is where we're going to store carbon dioxide that we've taken in when the stoma were open, and where we're also going to accumulate oxygen that's going to be released later when it's safe to open the stoma. Okay, and here are the actual cells with the mesophyll cells that have the chloroplasts in them. That's where photosynthesis is going to occur. Okay? And if we look at one of these mesophyll cells, remember the central vacuole in plant cells, that large storage organelle that stores water? Well, we're going to need that water for photosynthesis. And the chloroplasts are the organelle that's going to actually change the kinetic energy of the photons of light into the stored chemical energy of glucose. And we'll look at that coming up very quickly. So again, carbon dioxide coming in, oxygen's being lost, and it's happening in the chloroplasts in the mesophyll of the leaf. So if we look at a chloroplast structure, we talked a little bit about this a long time ago when we talked about cells, but remember there's a double membrane, almost like the chloroplast was ingested but not digested. And then in the very middle, there's all these thin thylakoid discs, which are in stacks called granum. And then surrounding them is this thick liquid called stroma, which is different from stoma, which is the opening out in the leaf. Stroma is the thick liquid surrounding the thylakoid membranes in stacks called granum. Okay, and if we blow this up, what we see is in the thylakoid membrane, this is where the pigment molecules are found. Okay, and that's where part of photosynthesis is going to start. And then out here in the stroma is where the second part of photosynthesis is going to occur. So the next thing to consider is what exactly is light energy and how can it be used in photosynthesis? Well, light energy is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. This would include sound energy. This would include gamma rays, X-rays, microwaves, radio waves, ultraviolet and infrared radiation, and then, of course, visible light. And visible light, the light we can see, is a really thin part of this electromagnetic spectrum, very thin part of it. There's an awful lot of other radiation or electromagnetic energy that we can't detect with our eyes. And of course, if you've ever seen a prism or a rainbow or maybe some oil on the surface of water, we know that light can be separated into the various wavelengths that make up all the different visible colors. Okay, now a wavelength, if you look at an electromagnetic wave, right, it's going to go up to a crest and then down to a trough and then up to a crest, down to a trough, and the wavelength is the different distance between crest to crest or trough to trough or any other equal point on the wave. Okay, but again, only of all the wavelengths, only a very small portion can actually be seen, and plants are going to use the wavelengths that are in this visible light range too for photosynthesis. The longer the wavelength, the less energy it's carrying. So the shorter wavelengths, so we're up here, gamma has the most energy, radio waves have the least energy, and then everything else is somewhere in between. Okay, so how does visible light drive photosynthesis? Well, visible light is going to be absorbed by pigments. Pigments are molecules that identify or recognize a specific wavelength of light and then have molecules inside that are able to absorb that energy. But not all energy is absorbed. Wavelengths of light that aren't as useful are reflected. And green is the worst wavelength of visible light for photosynthesis. So that's why you see so much green, because that's the light that's being released, either reflected or transmitted, but not usually being used. Okay, it's the other wavelengths of light that have more energy that plants have evolved the ability to get energy from that. Okay, so light comes in as a photon of light energy with a certain amount of energy associated with it. Again, not all light has the same energy. Shorter the wavelength, the greater the energy. If you're useful, you get absorbed and you're used for photosynthesis. And if you're not, then you're reflected or transmitted. So discussion question, based on this image, which of these four choices has the most energy? All right, well, if we look at the scale, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy, right? So visible violet light is short. Visible red light, well, visible violet is shorter than the red light. Red light's a little longer, about 700 nanometers to 400 nanometers. Ultraviolet radiation is here. Okay, infrared has got even less energy than the visible light. So ultraviolet radiation would have the most energy. And then in order, violet light, and then visible red light, and then the infrared radiation. Now, pigments, again, located in the thylakoid membrane, it's not like each pigment can absorb every wavelength of light. Pigments have evolved to only recognize specific, or to absorb specific wavelengths of light. And the molecules that make up their composition are those wavelengths are going to produce the most energy transfer. And the main pigments in photosynthesis are chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and beta carotene. There are a variety of chlorophylls. I think there's 5 different chlorophylls, but only A and B are the best for chlorophyll. And in beta carotene, you can see it uses wavelengths of light that are not as ideal. Chlorophyll A is really best at using light that's down here in the purple to blue range. Chlorophyll B, more in the blue range, and then chlorophyll A kind of peaks out here just at the bottom of the blue range. So a little less energy than what these two require. But then notice they all drop off down here. This is why green light has really low energy. You can see it on the table. There just isn't much energy there. But notice that chlorophyll A and B can also start to function pretty good when we get to the shorter level of visible light. And that's why A and B are such good pigments, because they have two kind of, I want to say, peak energy levels of light that they function at, not just one like you see with the carotenoids, which beta carotene is one of the carotenoids. All right, so discussion question. How does it benefit a photosynthetic organism to have more than one type of pigment? Take a minute and think about it. Pause the video. Write down your answer. When you're ready, fire it back up. Well, here's the deal. Just because certain wavelengths of light aren't the best for chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, or beta carotene, there's still energy there. And it benefits a photosynthetic organism to be able to use some of that light energy, even though it's not the best. And so there are other pigments. There are xanthophylls and cyanins that use those wavelengths of light that chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and beta carotene can't use. And you see these pigments in the fall when it isn't productive for deciduous trees to produce chlorophyll anymore. See, chlorophyll is an expensive pigment to produce. And so a lot of plants don't start to produce it until, well into spring when they leaf out. And then in the fall, when there isn't enough sunlight in the day to make it beneficial to make chlorophyll, they stop producing it. And that's when you see the secondary pigments, the reds and browns and yellows, that can use those other wavelengths of light. So the plant isn't just throwing everything away, but it's trying to harvest a little bit of energy from those too. Now, the way photons work is, you remember the structure of atoms, right? You've got the nucleus of the atom, and then you've got electrons in valence shells. And when electrons in a valence shell, and we fill from the nucleus out, but when an electron's in a valence shell, it has a certain amount of energy. And when we hit electrons with photons of light energy, it can temporarily excite them and give them more energy than they had before. And that causes them to jump to a higher energy level that's farther from the nucleus. But the thing is, they don't want to stay there. They're not stable there. And so they quickly jump to a higher energy level, but they're going to come back. They're going to come back to a ground state. And that's when we're going to be able to harvest that energy. Okay? We hit the electron with photons of light energy, and we increase the potential energy that electron has, and we push it up to an unstable excited state. But it doesn't want to stay there. It comes back to the ground state. And you can see here, it absorbs the energy, jumps up. When it comes back, of course, it's going to lose some heat energy, but it can also give up a lot of that energy that it gained, and now it's back to its ground state where it can be excited again. Now this is oversimplified. We'll see it's a little more complicated than that. But this is how we are able to harvest that energy from the photons of light. As we move into photosynthesis, what we're going to see is that there are two very separate stages of photosynthesis, what are called the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reactions require light, okay? And in those reactions, this is where we're going to excite electrons and then couple those electrons with an electron transport chain, which is going to push protons across the membrane, and we're going to make ATP, kind of like we did in the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis in cellular respiration. And of course, this is going to occur in the thylakoid membranes. The second part, which is light independent, doesn't use light, and it doesn't mean it has to happen in the dark. It just doesn't use light. This is the Calvin cycle. This is where we're going to take our carbon dioxide and we're going to reduce it to form sugar. And we're going to use products of the light reaction to do this, okay? And so what will happen in the next video, in the next lecture, is we're going to take a closer look at what's really happening in the chloroplast during the light reactions, during the Calvin cycle, and how these two together conduct photosynthesis. All right, so at this point, these are the terms you want to focus on for this part of Chapter 8. And these are the key concepts that you want to be ready to be tested on the exam.